Welcome to the Comics Coffee Metal Podcast, episode 17.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of a new series I am calling Blind Spot. The focus of this series is for me to take a deep dive into some media that has been around for quite a while, but I have just not, experienced, gotten into, read, listened to, what have you. There is a gargantuan amount of things I have missed and things I have avoided because I thought of them a certain way, and perhaps it's not the way I should have thought about them, and I should give them a shot and check it out. So this series is a good excuse for me to get off my butt and do just that. First up, we have a band that I have known about since their first release, but at the time their style was not something I was into. I could not tell you off the top of my head any of their songs. You could have played one of their songs for me and I'd be like, who is this? And for a long time I actually confused them with In Flames in discussions. And the band in question is Machine Head. Now, I've been aware of Machine Head for quite a while, again, since I've heard of them ever since they released their first album. They released their first album, I think I was a freshman in high school, and I remember seeing, a lot of Machine Head shirts and things like that, and people talking about them over the years, but I've never just dove in, and, in 1996, you couldn't really jump onto iTunes or Spotify and just check out a band. You had to go to the record store and hope they had your the CD you were wanting to listen to queued up on their listening station. So as time passed, I heard less and less about this band, but there's been kind of a resurgence of them the past 10 to 15 years, and media being so readily available now, I still had not just tried out and checked it out. But thankfully I have some buddies who are big Machine Head fans. Shout out to Ray Wagner, especially him, because I know he's a big fan, and just seeing them mentioned again and seeing Rob Flynn mentioned a lot in the news articles for metal websites and things like that, I kind of started getting my interest piqued again, like, oh, what are these guys really about? I should really check this out. So I took to Twitter, I asked some questions around, like, what should I start? And then eventually the idea of just starting from the beginning and going all the way through with open eyes, because I'd also picked up that there was a lot of derision or a lot of controversy involving some of their albums in terms of direction and things they've done, and while I think currently they are very well regarded and they're very successful, there was a time around their third or fourth album that they were kind of laughed at, or people didn't like what they were doing. Now, in doing research and checking things out, I kind of see that really wasn't the case in terms of just overall, opinion. There were some mitigating factors to some of the hiccups they may have had and all that. And while some people might not like the direction they took, I can't argue that it wasn't successful for them. But also, there's plenty of stuff to go back and kind of listen to, and just, there's a ton of albums this band has put out at this point. So, and I kind of like the idea of the fact that they've had some twists and turns, and I am really was interested to see what those did and how they handled that, and what exactly these new elements that they put in and took away, or what have you, whatever happened, during the course of these albums and all that. So I was very glad I did this, and if you're listening to this, most likely you are a fan of Machine Head or a fan of metal in general, so I don't, think a full-on biography of the band is in order, but just a real quick refresher, or just a quick run-up on the basics of the band. Machine Head was formed in 1991 by Rob Flynn and bassist Adam Duce. Rob had been in the thrash band Violence years prior, and this was his first undertaking, I think, as a vocalist and guitarist. They then recruited guitarist Logan Mader and drummer Tony Costanza to form Machine Head. Flynn picked the name because he, thought it sounded cool, which I'm sure is, 99% of the, way people choose their band name anyway. They eventually, in quick order, recorded a demo and were picked up by Roadrunner Records. They released their debut album in 1994, which, as I mentioned, I was really mistaken. That was not my freshman year of high school. I was, I think, 7th grade in 94, maybe 6th grade. One of those two. But it also makes sense why I would have seen more Machine Head merch by the time I got to high school, because they'd been around for a few years. Now, over the years, they've had some lineup changes, but the most consistent is vocalist and guitarist and main songwriter Rob Flynn. He's pretty much Machine Head at this point. He's the only original member left. Rob's former bandmate from Violence, Phil Demel, was also in the band for quite a long time and was considered, one of the mainstays. Bassist Adam Duce left sometime in the early 2010s. They've worked with a bunch of legendary producers at this point, like the aforementioned Colin Richardson. They worked with Ross Robinson, though I believe in latter years now, Rob produces all the albums himself. And despite some hiccups that we'll mention later, they were with Roadrunner Records until the mid-2010s, when they then signed with Nuclear Blast. And they remain signed there to this day, and as far as I can tell from the internet, there is a new album in the works. And upon its release, that will mark their 10th album, which is a pretty huge milestone for any band to make, much less one that's had such a storied history as this band. So there we go. We have our little refresher kind of idea of Machine Head and the people involved. So let's dive into their first album, Burn My Eyes. So when I started listening to this album, I really wasn't sure what to expect. I knew they were metal, I knew some of the history behind it, and that was it. I didn't know what kind of metal they were. I didn't know if they were more like death metal or groove metal or even just, straight up new metal or just traditional metal, whatever metal. But while I wasn't sure what to expect, I was pleasantly surprised this is completely something I could jam out to. The groove of this album is really reminiscent of bands like Prong, Pantera, and Sepultura, and that was something I was very pleasantly surprised with. I really like all three of those bands, and I just really liked hearing like another version of all those influences kind of melding together and doing something like that. And while those influences are very present, none of it really feels like they're derivative or generic. The intro to The Rage to Overcome is a clear example of that. You got some heavy drums with some little guitar trickery that leads into even a Slayer X, little gallop riff that it's the type of thing that will, really get my attention every single time a band does something like that. Additionally, especially for the time, the production is like top notch. Colin Richardson did a fantastic job. Everything sounds heavy and thick, but not muddy. The bass cuts through beautifully with a great tone. The guitar tone is just, grindy and crushing and chuggy and just, that, yeah. that good feeling that gets when you get a perfectly distorted guitar. I was also really appreciative of the mixing of the bass. It really cuts through with heavy guitars and heavy metal. It's very easy for bass to get kind of lost in the mix, but it cuts through really well. And as apparent on this album and in future albums, they really give the bass, time to shine and not be ignored. Not that it's really a flashy thing, but you get the moment where you can hear the bass and it sounds really cool and it sounds really good. Really great tone on that bass. I can't say that enough. For a debut album, I can see why they kind of made a big splash. I was pretty mad at myself for not checking this out sooner, actually. I could have been jamming this album for years and years at this point. There's lots of great tunes on this album, but I have to say that my favorite is probably Old. I think the most popular is Davidian, and that's a great track as well, but I think that Old encapsulates all the things I liked about this album. The groove riffs, the groove. I'm a sucker for some good groove metal, and these guys definitely do it well, and again, it doesn't sound generic or like they're doing a paint by numbers. Here's how we do the grip, here's how we do this beat and a halftime this and blah, blah, blah. No, they really put it all to it. There's a lot of like soul and like just kind of just vibe to the whole song and to the whole album. So yeah, the groovy riffs, the strong bass presence, and just a great contrast between verses and choruses. So for Burn My Eyes, you guys did it. You did a great job with the debut album. If I had bothered to listen to this album, 15 to 18 years ago, I would have been all about it this entire time. So shame on me, but it's in my library now, and I'm grooving on it, and I really dig it. So let's end this discussion of Burn My Eyes with a little sample of my favorite track, Old. Alright, now we're on to the second album from Machine Head, their sophomore effort, The More Things Change. Well, I'll be honest. At first listen, I was not too into this follow-up and was kind of certain that they fell into that sophomore slump kind of thing where they come out strong and they have these batches of songs that they were honing for years, and they release a new album and it's not that great. But I I tried to approach this with giving things time to breathe, give these albums the same chances I would give new albums I would be listening to. So most new albums, I try to give them 2 to 3 listens before I kind of solidify my opinion of it. And since I had a bit of a gap between starting this experiment and going back and having to re-listen to things again just to refresh my own mind, I was discovering that I was, pleasantly wrong about this album. This is a great follow-up, and my opinion, every good and not a little bit better than Burn My Eyes. The influences I mentioned on the previous album have coalesced, and I think instead of being a band that shows their influences, they kind of now sound like their own band. They have the influences. You can always pick an influence out of a band if you know it, but in the act of listening of it, I'm not thinking, oh, that's a Pantera groove, or that's a kind of prong kind of verse, or that's a Sepultura, kind of drum kind of fill or beat thing happening. It really kind of this is Machine Head, and I was really happy to hear that. Again, production, excellent. The bass tone is even better than the last album, and I really appreciate that. I'm actually gonna have to try to isolate some things and do my best to try to recreate it, because I gotta steal that tone, bro. It's really good. The songs on this album compared to Burn My Eyes, and I hate to say it this way because it sounds kind of just, I don't know, a little hoity-toity or whatever, but they have a bit more maturity. It's the best way I can put it. Rob Flynn and company, they're not afraid to mix, slow plodding riffs with, just some lighter passages, and toss in some more thrash-like grooves and diversions here and there. I think the album starts with its strongest track, and that's 10 Ton Hammer. It's not to say it's completely downhill from there, not in the slightest. They just kind of blew open the gate with that. Other songs, Bay of Pigs, Violate Blistering, have maybe better riffs than what you can find in 10 Ton Hammer, but as a whole, that song really encapsulates the feel of the album, what you're going to get, and it's the one I kind of, even though it's the first track, I don't always, after I've listened to an album, I don't always go immediately back to the first track, but the few times I've listened to this album now, I always make sure to start with that one. It's like a perfect Machine Head song for the time. So I can safely say that, in my opinion, Machine Head definitely avoided that sophomore slump. So let's give a listen to my favorite song. Can you guess? 10 Ton Hammer. So now we are on Machine Head's third album, The Burning Red. First and foremost, if you held a gun to my family's head and demanded of me to guess when exactly this album was produced, I, without a single microsecond of hesitation, would say 1999. The extremely dry and boxy drums, the guitar tone, emphasis on simpler grooves makes this very much a product of its time. It was really no surprise when I saw that it was produced by Ross Robinson. I really enjoy Ross Robinson's, offerings for the most part. Wherever he produces, he's produced Korn, he's produced Slipknot. He's got a resume, and he's well deserved. Having a legendary type status in metal producer. Dumb, if you can say something as ridiculous as that. And yeah, but it's definitely of the time. It was definitely a sound a lot of bands were going with, but I don't have a problem with that because if something sounds good, and if it sounds good at the time, people are going to try to emulate it. And they didn't just try to emulate it, they took the guy who defined that sound and had him produce their album. Again, all this is not to say I don't like this album. I actually really do like this album. I know fans are a little less hot on this one, especially since Rob Flynn started kind of adding in some more rap elements in his vocal delivery. But, even though they've seemingly simplified a lot of things, the core musicianship is there, and that kind of elevates it above a lot of records of that time that were going for the same sound, but didn't have the talent or skill or pedigree to really do anything other than derivatives of Korn or, Slipknot or what have you. I can understand that fans of the last two albums would have an issue with this direction, but as someone who doesn't hate a lot of nu metal, this is probably one of the best albums of that time, a new genre. Is it even nu metal? I don't know. There's still a lot of older, it's the band's, third album, but their previous influences on it, they're still there. It's just there's things that are kind of like just refined a little bit more, if you want to, or just taking a step back in terms of complexity. But these guys know how to write songs, man, and they have a skill level that just doesn't let this become an album anyone can play with one finger and a 7-string guitar. The Blood, the Sweat, the Tears, I think is one of the best Machine Head tracks, period. I jam that song a lot. It's a really good song. Rob's delivery of the, I'll put in quotation marks, rapping parts, works best on this album. And if I'm completely honest, I wouldn't really consider it rapping. It's just kind of a fast rhythmic delivery, which I guess you can, if you want to be pedantic, that is rapping. And it's not, because thrash did that a lot. There was no, I guess, I don't know, there's a thing rap has that wasn't being delivered there. And I'm fine with that. It still sounded good. But at the time, that kind of delivery really wasn't anything you were finding in metal. He wasn't exactly doing the fast rhythmic stuff that thrash bands do. I understand that. But he also wasn't going full on rapping like a lot of these guys were. He wasn't Fred Dursting it up or anything like that. Which I'm not here to discuss the legitimacy of Fred Durst as a rapper, just kind of giving an example. The parts that really don't fit the nu metal mold and not the groove metal of the previous albums, it's all still solid songs, and they honestly wouldn't be an iota out of place in anything released in the past 10 years. Except for that Message in a Bottle cover. That's hot garbage, guys. Machine Head, not to bury the lead here, I love you guys. What? Not good. I'm not a fan of that at all. In the mortal words of Lars Ulrich's father in the Some Kind of Monster documentary, I would delete that. The album ends on the title track, The Burning Red, which is a somber dirge that I will definitely be adding to some of my sad time draw boy playlists. Other high points of the album include Exhale the Vial, Desire to Fire, which has some more of those quote-unquote rapping elements, and Silver. Again, though, the album's strongest track is the aforementioned The Blood, the Sweat, the Tears, and I will happily put that song in any playlist I am making for any type of activity where I need to get physical. Get your mind out of the gutters, guys. So let's listen to a bit of that track and get ready for the next album. It's the one, you know which one this is. As I just said, here's the fourth album from Machine Head. You guys know which one this is. It's the probably most hated Machine Head album. It's probably the most divisive album. I've done a bit of research on this because I want to understand the context of this album. I want to give everything its fair shake. I'm a bit more open-minded because I didn't start off with these guys when they were new. So any changes in the direction, to me, that's just what this band did, not some sort of betrayal of what they promised, what they were capable of, or what they were doing. So I completely get why some people would not like this album. You know, I came into Metallica with Load and Reload, and I went back and I, loved the thrash stuff just as much as everything else. But if I had started with Kill 'Em All or Bride or Master or what have you, even the Black Album, getting Load and Reload, I can see why people were not fans. But as someone who came in during that era, I had a bit more of an open mind and accepting of all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the approach I'm taking here with Supercharger. Again, I went in with the most open of minds on this one, but ultimately I have to agree. This is the weakest and least enjoyable album in their catalog. I have to give them some credit for still trying to infuse their musicianship and skill into another new metalish release. But the parts that are good and heavy and full of that Machine Head spark are just really heavily overshadowed by the parts that just do not work for me. Upon first listen, my thoughts were far more pessimistic about it, but this album isn't also a complete stinker. Bulldozer is a jam and a pretty good opener. White Knuckle Blackout is solid. Crashing Around You is good as well. And actually, I'm kind of listening to this right now as I kind of make some notes about this, and I think I'm much more on board with some of these songs than I was in the first two listens. There's a lot of good melodic hard rock stuff happening, and maybe that's what adds to the general opinion of the album. Around 2001, at the time of this album's release, nu metal and grunge kind of were fading pretty hard, and some kind of new offshoot of rock, which we could now call hard rock, was kind of born. And that stuff that had just like heavier guitars, a lot more melody, and more singing, less screaming, more guys trying to sing, not just kind of yelling over what have you. And with Machine Head coming from groove metal, it is quite a switch. That's not to say this album is an underrated masterpiece by any means. There are 14 tracks on this album and a lot of similar approaches to songs. One thing I can think of is a lot of them start with like a heavily affected clean guitar as an intro and verse, and then you go into like a slower, simplified, heavy chorus, and that doesn't really reflect the band's ability, and it kind of leads to a I'm not mad, guys, I'm just disappointed vibe. You could reasonably trim this album in half, and it would be a stronger overall release. Blank Generation and American High, I think, serve as this album's low points. But Trephination is a standout track for me, with Deafening Silence being my second favorite. This album marked the end of an era for Machine Head, and what comes next was something I think a lot of people didn't think would happen. So let's give a little listen to Trepanation as we prepare for, I can only call this Machine Head 2.0.
There was a part of me left far behind when, at the age of 5 years old, I had my innocence taken from me. Emptiness would fill the hole. Now a second grader, thinking why I don't feel better, why I'm filthy, why the hell I feel so guilty. With trying stick men, or pornographic men and women, thinking all the time there's something wrong with me. Every day for 3 years, from dawn till dusk on my way, we tape it and clip it and crystal me so much that it's right inside with the hole in my temple.
Okay, so here we are with the what I'm calling really lamely Machine Head 2.0. We have their 5th album, Through the Ashes of Embers. And this was definitely a turning point for the band, I think. Despite the relative failure of Supercharger, Rob Flynn and company, they have not been regretful or even ashamed of the changes in direction that they took around that time. In fact, upon doing some research about Supercharger, after it was released, they lost a lot of their marketing support from Roadrunner because the 9/11 attacks happened, and the video for their song Crashing Around You, which featured buildings crashing, was quickly pulled, and just a lot of the support they had that could have made this album probably their most successful album based on the trajectory of how they were going, made their I believe least successful album, or at least at the time just kind of a bomb. So having all the support pulled out from under you, it leads to understandably lower sales and just general status in the music industry. So obviously pissed off about Roadrunner's abandonment of them, they left the label, and Rob self-produced Through the Ashes of Empires. And while this album was still released through Roadrunner's international label, it ended up being such a success overseas that Roadrunner US re-signed Machine Head to a much more favorable deal. Though I'm going to say Ashes of Empires is not a grand return to form, but it's also not a drastic change. It may seem such at first, but digging deeper, it takes a lot of the more melodic aspects of the Burning Red and Supercharger, while adding the groove and aggression of Burn My Eyes and The More Things Change. The end result is one of their best, or arguably the best, album in their catalog. The opening track, Imperium, is just a barnstormer of an opener, and it closes out with the epic Descend the Shades of Night. It's just a really, really kick-ass album. This album showcases everything the band is capable of and kind of silences all those who doubted them. It really served as a springboard for the next few albums to come, and really showed that anyone who's going to write Rob Flynn and crew off for experimenting and kind of doing their own thing, they should have second-guessed themselves before they did that. So let's give a listen to my favorite track, Imperium. Okay, so here we are with the next grouping of albums. I've decided to group these albums not because they're bad, boring, or unpredictable, but I can say the same thing about every single one of these albums, so I would just be repeating myself 3 times. And the albums in question are The Blackening, Unto the Locust, and Bloodstone and Diamonds. It's just that all 3 of these albums are just consistently good. And if I were to talk about each one individually, I think by the end I would just be like, oh, that was good, and this was awesome, and that was great. Just a cycle of that, just eating my own tail about that endlessly. So these albums are Machine Head kind of running on all cylinders. I also kind of find myself less endeared to them than the previous albums. I've probably listened to them the most just because I feel like they should be sticking with me more than they are, but they just aren't. Maybe that'll change over time. Maybe I'll finally have them click with me. Again, it's not that they're bad. It's not that I don't enjoy them. It's not that I can't listen to them. It's just that when I think about putting on a Machine Head album, it's never really any of these three. I think I found the more drastic experiments and sound of the group finding themselves a bit more interesting than after the fact. But do not get me wrong, these albums kick many forms of ass. I've drawn many things listening to them. I've run many miles listening to them. It's just, again, when I'm thinking, oh, I want to listen to some Machine Head, it's not anything really from these albums. So I can't really pick favorite tracks from each of these albums. So I don't think I'm going to play anything from them because it just, they're just really good albums, man. You like some metal, you listen to these albums. Maybe my opinions will change and I'll end up loving these more than the others. But for me, they're just good albums to put on. Nothing's really standing out to me like, wow, that's something really cool they're doing. It's just a band doing what they do, doing it well. And while I've talked about bands who have done that with their new releases lately on the show, for them, I guess having 3 in a row, it is what it is. I wish I could, have plethora of beautiful things to say about each of these albums, but again, it's almost difficult when a band's doing well. I guess it's everything good about these albums. I've mentioned it before. Everything good that they do, is stuff I like that I've mentioned before. So it's again a snake eating its own tail. A sneak eating its own tail. Get your shit together, Don. Can't even get out of this discussion without screwing it up. So before I trip on myself any further, they're great albums. Give them a listen. They're definitely, in the middle of the road of Machine Head albums. And with a band having 9 albums, some are going to end up in the middle and they're still going to be good. Not everything's going to be a fight for number 1. But The Blackening, Unto the Locust, Bloodstone and Diamonds, great metal albums. Now, can I say that about their next and 9th album, the most recent release, Catharsis? Well, here it is. I'm kind of eating my words almost immediately. This album features quite a few tonal shifts and punk influences on a lot of tracks, and I'm just kind of not digging it at all. The album isn't at all bad. There are high points. Psychotic and Screaming at the Sun are both excellent, and in due time, I may grow to like this album, like other things I've been mentioning as a whole. But right now, I'm probably more likely to put on Supercharger again than this. As always, Machine Head has talent and skill, and sometimes the music they follow is not one we all go along. I don't doubt the spirit and drive that they have to produce music they love. I don't doubt their ability to just surprise us and do really kick-ass stuff. It's just this time around wasn't for me, I guess. And I guess in closing of this whole conversation, I kind of wish more bands were like Machine Head. There's a thing Machine Head does. I wish more bands would, do. I wish they would take more risks. I wish they would, follow the weird muse a little bit more here and there. Like when Godsmack first came out, I loved them, and they put out album after album after album of the same stuff. And, the direction they've gone in most recent years, it's taken them so long to kind of like go from a groovier metal type thing to a hard rock radio staple thing. that it just was kind of boring, and it's not that I don't like the band anymore. It's just, I wish they would have pushed their envelope a little bit more and tried some new and different things other than just kind of, having the one or two radio singles and then kind of building off those formulas. And Machine Head definitely takes risks. I really appreciated that. Can I call myself a Machine Head fan now? Hell yeah. Undoubtedly, I don't love everything there is, but there's enough to pull me in and keep me coming back to them and keep putting them in my ever-growing rotation of bands and playlists and songs and albums. I can always count on a new album of theirs to have some great guitar riffs and, at the very least, a couple of full-on bangers. I respect and admire them for doing what they do and not trying to backpedal when it's received less than warm. Machine Head's gonna Machine Head, and I'll be here to see what's next. So, thank you for listening to this first episode of Blind Spot. I have a few more topics in mind that I'll be doing deep dives on, a couple more bands, some comic series. But if you have any suggestions for me, please let me know. Find me at Twitter at Don Cardenas Art, or on Instagram at Don Cardenas Art. And send me a note, send me a tweet, send me a message like saying, hey, have you checked out these guys? They have a catalog. Have you checked out this book? It's got a few volumes out. Let's broaden my horizons. I want to know what people love and what I've missed. So that's it. So that's it for this episode. Thanks again for listening, and please come back next time where we're back to our interviews, and I will be talking to archer, storyboard artist, comic book artist, fantastic musician, and all-around great guy, Kevin Mellon. See you then.
Thanks again for listening to the Comics Coffee Metal Podcast. This episode was brought to you with the help of my patrons, Mark Warner and John Dubs. If you would like to support the show and get early access to episodes, thank you mentions in the credits, exclusive artwork and comics, music downloads and videos, please consider going to www.patreon.com/DonCardenasArt and becoming a patron. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.